The rapid nature of urbanization is what government leaders need to be mindful of. Some of the mega cities a few years ago we did not think they would be as big, and they've become so. And increasingly, it's probably going to even be more rapid now. The unemployment pressure that is pushing young people from rural areas into urban centers and is going to just explode over time.
With the world's lowest median age, rapid urbanization, cities that are being built today that will be massive by the end of the century, also with real challenges from climate disruption, Africa is the place where so many of the great transformations of our time are coming together, crystallizing, shaping the future for families and their communities. Particularly with urbanization, there's a great opportunity to build cities of the future that put the needs of families first. That is, if political leaders will be responsive. Joseph Asunka is the CEO of Afrobarometer, which listens to the voices of Africans across 42 countries and feeds their views back to policymakers. He is my guest today. I'm Joe Waters. This is Per Capita. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Good to meet you. My namesake.
So I know you by reputation, but I don't know you. This is the first time we've met. And so I'd like to just start our conversation today with who are you?
My name is Joe Asunka. I work as the CEO of Afrobarometer. Afrobarometer is a Pan-African survey research organization headquartered in Accra, but working in about 40 countries across the continent. So I've worked at Afrobarometer for about 5 years now, and leading both the research side, but also the communication and engagement side of things. In terms of background, I'm a political scientist. I studied political science at the University of California at Los Angeles, so I got my PhD, and I taught briefly in the politics department before heading out to the Bay Area, where I worked at the Hewlett Foundation as a grant maker for about 5 years before going to Afrobarometer to serve as the CEO.
Great. So it's my view that if we want to get ahead of the future, we need to go to the leading edge of that future. And demographically, at least, the leading edge of the future is Africa. You're listening to people all across Africa. And I'm just curious, what are the things that Africans have top of mind based on your survey research at Afrobarometer?
Great. I'm glad that you started with this question. And often this is the starting point of our advocacy work. Our principle is to make sure that citizen voice and citizen priorities are at the table when policymakers are making decisions about what to do in terms of development and governance more broadly. And so one of the questions we ask our respondents across about 40 countries is, what is the biggest thing or the policy priority that you have that government should be focusing on, should be addressing? We've been asking this question for the past 26 years over time. So across the continent, consistently, we've had unemployment almost being the topmost issue across the continent to date until the last survey round that we conducted between 2024 and 2025, the one that we just completed. We've seen that health has moved to the top of the list of policy priorities. This is the first time that health has actually overtaken unemployment.
And what do you ascribe the change to? How have we gone from unemployment for almost 2 decades to now health being a priority? What's happened in the last year, you think, to drive that?
Even though on average we have these two issues being at the top, when you go to the country level, there are differences in terms of what comes up as the biggest policy priority. So take the Sahel region. For much of the Sahel region, especially in Burkina Faso and Mali, we've seen that security and crime have become their biggest policy priority. It's across the entire Sahel belt, including in Nigeria. Security is very high on their policy priority list. And so we see that these policies shift depending on the context. But the reason for health becoming a top issue, we think, has to do with the ripple effect of COVID-19, where it looks like the healthcare system has been strained quite a bit. And additionally, with the destruction of USAID, which used to be a biggest funder in the healthcare sector, may have impacted people's feelings and experiences of healthcare delivery. And that is because we conducted some of the surveys right after the withdrawal,
Okay,
and some of the withdrawal had immediate impacts. It did not take long before we started to feel that.
great. So, one of the things we've also been very interested in is declining fertility across the world, right? And so, this has been pronounced for decades. I mean, in some cases, even going back to before the Second World War in Northern Europe. Total fertility still remains high among most African countries, in most African countries, but it's declining. So, as young Africans look to the future, to the decisions that they're taking about starting a family or not starting the family, how are they viewing the future in the surveys that you all are conducting, and how might that shape their decisions to have children, to start families, and so forth?
Right. So, I mean, it's a mix of issues here. So, one, the fact that young people on the continent see unemployment as their biggest issue. And if you break down people who prioritize unemployment as the priority for governments to address, young people are more likely to point at unemployment as their biggest issue. And so even though the last survey that did show that healthcare has become a big issue on average, if you break it down demographically, young people are more likely to talk about unemployment. And we think that now this challenge with unemployment is likely to feature or factor into people's decisions about having families and thinking about the number of children to have. And so ultimately, of course, the economic ability of individuals is what would influence their decisions about whether or not to, the number of children to have. But more
Sure.
importantly, given that Africa has become increasingly more urban, and over time, of course, by mid-century, the population is of the urban centers is going to be way more than even those in rural areas. And that is going
Hmm.
to then constrain people's decision making about family size and the like. So we would see this global, shift in population decline or the global move towards fewer children per family is likely to find its way in Africa before long.
Let's talk a little bit about this question of urbanization. In some
Yeah,
ways, it seems to me to be one of the biggest stories of the 21st century so
absolutely.
far, urbanization in Africa. You look at some of the predictions, they're pretty astounding. There was a paper a few years ago from a university in Canada predicting that Lagos might have a population of 88 million people by the end of the century. You're going to get down into the 20s before you get to current big cities like New York and Tokyo. You also will have in a sense cities that are not yet developed emerging as potentially mega cities. We've seen that with Abuja. I mean, Abuja was 40 years ago did not exist. And now, as the capital of Nigeria, a major city in Africa and a major city in the world. And we're particularly interested in the development that can center the needs of families, particularly those families with young children. So, how can city leaders in Africa be intentional and thoughtful and responsive to their populations, particularly when it's happening so rapidly?
Right. I mean, I think it's the rapid nature of urbanization that is what government leaders need to be mindful of. Some of the mega cities a few years ago we did not think they would be as big, and they've become so. And increasingly, it's probably going to even be more rapid now, giving, first of all, the unemployment pressures that is pushing young people from rural areas into urban centers, and is going to just explode over time. At least in the next 5 to 10 years, certainly is going to explode. And so the first thing is to think about the infrastructure system in the cities, because that is always one of the biggest concerns or the biggest frictions when it comes to, urbanization. So infrastructure, the food systems and food supply systems. Of course, as urbanization increases, it's likely that agriculture is going to take a hit because young people are moving into the cities and they are looking into industry for employment. The question then becomes, how do you ensure you maintain food supplies in a way that does not create frictions and instability in the cities as they struggle for just limited amounts of food? And so I think one thing governments and leaders can do is, first of all, just invest in large-scale agricultural production because your small scale subsistence farming is not going to make it or cut it for the populations in the urban centers. And if food shortages do hit the urban centers, there's likely to be anxiety and protest, and that is going to create a lot more instability for governments. So I think focusing on food systems to ensure that food supplies, especially into urban centers, is taken care of. And that can only be done with large scale investment, investments in large scale farming, where we can have production being done, and of course, with mechanized agriculture in a way that allows government or food system to be able to supply the growing urban populations. But the second piece being the infrastructure systems in urban centers. Of course, when young people are in the cities, they want to be able to be mobile, to move around. And so creating already planning for infrastructure that can contain, just as you mentioned, you should plan for maybe three times the population of the city at the moment, so that the infrastructure that you are putting up now should be able to cater for three times that population in the next 5, 10 years. Otherwise, if we are planning for the current population size, will be overtaken by events. And I hope that governments will take care of that.
So I'm curious to know if you think some of the, so let me just back up and say 88 million people in Lagos seems rather outlandish to me, um, particularly given that those fertility rates, as we mentioned, are declining, and as a result, recent population estimates have missed the mark, particularly when it comes to fertility rates and that sort of thing. What's your thought on that? Do you have a thought on that? Are those predictions um, maybe they're viable, but do you think they're going to be hit?
They are viable in theory. It wouldn't be surprised if they get hit those marks and probably even in some places surpass what has been predicted. And I think that is one of the reasons. I'll say two things. One about fertility, but the first one that I want to talk about is just urban planning and the
Mhm.
way government systems are organized in Africa. Most places, I mean, in most African countries, governments are structured such that all the administrative functions are located in the national capital. So take, Ghana, for example. So the presidency is in Accra, the parliament sits in Accra, the judiciary sits in Accra, and everything that needs to be done is done in the small city. And yet we have large portions of land in other parts of the country where we could have a kind of redistribution and restructuring of government systems and institutions in a way that allows these institutions to be located at a distance place rather than the central part of the capital city. So, for example, if your legislature were to sit 100 kilometers away from the national capital, that shouldn't prevent any business from being conducted because, of course, now we mostly work virtually anyway.
Yeah. And South
So
Africa's done it, right?
yes, South
Yeah.
Africa has done it. Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg. You don't have to be in one place. And that way, once a government infrastructure moves into a particular city, then that city also begins to grow. And it will attract young people to different parts of the country in a way that eases congestion in the central business places. And I think if African governments can think of it that way, redistribute government institutions in a way that allows for the center of gravity to not be in the national capital. That will ease some of the congestion a bit. The second component will be on fertility. Of course, there has been lots of campaigns about family planning and the like across the continent by different actors. We have contributed to that debate. We have data on people's attitudes towards sexual reproductive health and rights issues, access to contraception, attitudes towards safe abortion or legal abortion and the like. And if you look across the continent, the data we have now, there's strong support for people's access to contraceptive contraceptives, regardless of the person's marital status. And of course, people's access to even legal abortion if the mother's age, health is in danger and the like. And so we do see that there's this growing support for it. I think government needs, and of course, government, civil society, and the private sector that are keenly interested in supporting the African family to be be more thoughtful in terms of ways in which people make decisions about the number of kids, children to have. I do think that there's general support for it on the continent. And if governments adopt policies that are pro family planning and giving people the tools to be able to think through or at least to plan their own families, there'll be a lot of receptivity. And I think governments can take advantage of that.
Joseph, I want to turn now to talk a little bit about migration, both within Africa and immigration out off the continent. This is one of the major stories of the 21st century. If we really think with a longer term perspective, 1 in 4 by mid-century workers in the world is going to be an African. We see Africa has a very low median age relative to other continents. As you mentioned, real concerns about unemployment on the continent, needs for workers in other parts of the world. So I just maybe ask first, help us to understand this phenomenon from the perspectives of the Africans who are responding to your surveys. How are they thinking about their opportunities, both within their own country, within their own countries, within other countries in Africa, and off the continent as well?
Previously, when we asked this question, I think that was in 2019, 2021, just around the COVID era. When we asked this question about migration, we had large majorities of Africans who intended to migrate, expressing a desire to relocate to another African country. And so when we rank it on average, people preferred, even if they wanted to move or migrate, they wanted to move within the continent. And then, of course, subsequent surveys, especially the latest survey that we conducted between 2024 and 2025, we've seen that that has shifted a lot. And now a majority of people who want to move would want to relocate outside of the continent.
Interesting. So just to
Yeah.
be clear, 2019, 2020, the majority of the people who wanted to move within Africa. The
Yes,
2024, 2025 survey, majority of the people who wanted to move want to move outside of Africa.
outside. Yes.
Interesting. And what
That's
do you attribute that change to?
Yeah, so I mean, the initial finding probably we thought it was also because of COVID-19 effects that people felt, okay, there's COVID-19 pandemic. Africa has not suffered as much as other parts of the world, so probably it's much safer to stay on the continent. This is just a guess in terms of what we've seen on in the data. But of course, there are other factors that may have contributed to that. Just thinking about the economic conditions at the time compared to this moment. And between, I think, 2012, 2015, the period when we talked about Africa rising and economies were doing well, you know, was home to some of the fastest growing economies. And there was this general sense that Africa was beginning to rise. And at that time, I mean, questions about migration didn't really we didn't see a big expression of people wanting to move. But since the downturn of the economies in Africa, we've seen that become more and more the case. And I think, especially between 2020 and now, this has become even more so. And we are not surprised that we're seeing more and more people saying they want to move outside of the continent. The top three reasons are all economic: to find a job, to better living conditions, and then to take care of families. It's just all about economic issues and less of the governance issues at the moment. And when we ask what is the top, or what is the preferred destination that people want to go to, and so even the 2019 onwards, I mean, from into 2019 surveys, we saw that most people wanted to relocate on the continent. This time, people have expressed interest in moving to the West. So either to North Africa or somewhere in Europe. And so that has
And
been the shift. Yeah.
and I mean, how is that? I mean, I feel like what I hear, right, here in the United States, also in Western Europe, a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? So, how do you account for that desire? And certainly, I can understand there's an economic desire, but at some point, people are going to have to balance economics with actually being welcomed in a place. So, how do you understand that phenomenon of the rhetoric is very much let's shut down immigration, but Africans are telling you they still want to come to Western Europe and North Africa and North America.
And I mean, it's always like when you are not in a place, the feeling of the grass is always greener out
Mm.
there. And, you know, if you are not there physically, the sense of anti-immigration, rhetoric may not hit you as hard as the economic, deprivation that you're suffering. And so the immediate need is I just need to get the opportunity to get there and see what can be done in that particular situation. And so you can see the push factors have a more immediate effect because they are feeling that now. But you may not be experiencing any xenophobia or any anti-immigrant sentiments in your immediate environment until you have moved and gone to experience that. And so I do think, when people express the desire to move to the West, it's the fact that they may face other issues beyond the economics that they are struggling to address is not immediately visible to them or they haven't experienced it directly. But that said, I think there's also this issue about, of course, as you rightly pointed out, populations in parts of the West growing older, the working population is shrinking. Then that means that, over time, there will be the need to have younger people take on certain roles. And that is likely to be African. And
Well,
so,
and particularly in the care economy, right? So you
yes,
think about,
yeah,
say, Denmark or Holland, not to pick on just two countries of Western Europe that are relatively old. They're going to have an incredible need now and in the next 25, 50 years for caregivers, right? And you have a young African population, a sizable percentage of which is interested in and willing to move for opportunity. So there's going to be a pull, right? There's going to be a pull to those Western
absolutely.
countries, particularly in the care economy.
Right. And I think that's when it gets to that, the question then becomes, of course, there's already this push factors from the continent, and there will be this pull factor from the West, from Western Europe, at least for now. The question is how you square that with this anti-immigration sentiment that is happening, across the Western Europe, but also in the United States. If it can become a win-win situation for Africa and the rest of the world, especially in Western Europe, where the African population can be a useful source of labor for some of the sectors that will struggle as the populations age in that part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I would just note too that, and again, speaking here as an American, in deeply listening deeply to the political rhetoric here in the United States, you have some Republicans now who, in addition to sort of opposition to illegal immigration, they are also saying we need to continue to attract highly skilled immigrants to the United States. And there's been a discussion about the H-1B visa. There's also this discussion about the golden ticket visa that Donald Trump has proposed and this sort of thing. Um, 2 points. Largely, I would imagine those things are inaccessible to a lot of the people who do want to immigrate for better economic opportunities. But second point, on the U.S. side and the U.S. rhetoric, when we say highly skilled, I think we tend to think software developer,
right,
right? We think
right.
about Sergey
Yeah,
Brin coming to this
yeah,
country and starting Google. We're not thinking about the care economy. We're not,
yeah,
and that is largely those are largely considered low wage, unskilled jobs. So actually, particularly, and I want to talk more about AI in Africa here later in the podcast, but when you think about AI and what it's going to do to the labor market, actually, Western Europe and the United States are going to need are what people what are actually very skilled jobs, but
Yeah.
which people do not consider very skilled care jobs in particular.
Absolutely. As much as you are thinking about having skilled labor in to support with, advanced things in your economy, you also know that the economy can only thrive when you have the menial jobs taken care of. Your offices are clean and your food is available at the food stalls because somebody is there doing that. You don't expect that skilled labor from Africa would want to come and do that kind of job because if you're attracting the very advanced skilled labor, you are expecting them to work in industries that demand that high levels of skills. And of course, a skilled labor in Africa may not be interested in the menial job that doesn't pay that much. And so it gets to a point where you ask yourself, who is going to fill those gaps if we do not create opportunities to have immigration from across the board? It is politically sound to say that we're only attracting people who are highly skilled because then it makes it sound like, okay, here we are being selective in who we bring in. But then if you select only those folks and you leave your cares, the care economy unattended to, the farm workers, the food storage, everything else that goes on to make sure that the citizenry, live comfortable lives with whatever they have,
Sure.
has to be a complete, it's a whole value chain. And that value chain needs to have people to make sure that all the pieces of the sections of the chain works, flow smoothly. And if you don't have that, of course, you're going to struggle.
So what I think I hear you saying is that given just demographic realities, African workers are going to be essential across that value chain over the rest of this century, both in Africa and out off the continent.
And I think that's where immigration policies will have to take into account to be able to address the entire value chain so that attracting labor should be seen as attracting labor to every sector of your economy where you are lacking. It's not one thing to just say it is skilled labor. The thing is, skilled labor, what gaps are we filling? Because we don't necessarily want to have an oversupply of skilled labor anyway, because that doesn't really help the economy if we leave out certain parts of the economy unattended to.
I want to turn now, Joseph, if we could, to talk about religion in Africa. This, again, is one of the great big stories, I think, of the
Absolutely.
21st century, that Africa is rapidly becoming more and more Christian. It's largely happening in a post-colonial way. So we're not talking about sort of the stereotypical French or English or Portuguese missionaries coming right alongside colonizers and converting populations. This has happened largely post the colonial period in Africa, and it's happening very rapidly. So, talk to me about how this phenomenon of religious affiliation away from traditional religions and to Christianity, again in a post colonial frame, how is that showing up in the work you all are doing, the listening that you are doing through your surveys?
Right. I mean, we have always collected data about, people's religious affiliation, and this is clear that more growing population, sizable numbers of the population is religious, and of course, religiosity in terms of the practice, the frequency of actually practicing a religion has grown over time. That people are intensely more religious and more attached to especially their faiths, and when it comes to Christian religion. And this is even more so on the Pentecostal side. So we do have the Orthodox Christians, whether it is, the Presbyterians or the Catholics and the like. They still are there, but the Pentecostal side of things has, almost overtaken the Orthodox churches at this moment. And of course, there are several reasons for that, and it has implications for what this means going forward. Some of the reasons being, of course, people want to have spaces where they can feel a sense of being connected. And that social connection, because across the African continent, people always strive for the social connection. And if there's urbanization happening, as we talked about earlier, in urban centers, it becomes more cosmopolitan, and those connections can easily fizzle away. But religion provides a hook for socialization and connection and belonging. And it's partly because of that, of course, it's a center for attraction, center for connection and feeling that you're connected both to your society, but also to an ultimate being that takes care of you in your hardships in a big city, for example. And then also, ultimately, even a source of entertainment, because the Pentecostal way of worship is so entertaining that it feels like every week you get the opportunity to really go entertain yourself in some way. And so there are a mix of factors that kind of make it so attractive to people, especially young people on the continent. But then it also has its consequences because the challenge is for people who lead these um, religious groupings are not necessarily the most savvy, the most well informed when it comes to thinking about religious texts and what those texts mean. And so those kinds of misinterpretations and representations, they are valuable to the leaders because they use it as a source of control.
Yeah, right.
And if you use it as a source of control, you can interpret it in a way that aligns with what you're trying to get at. And when it gets there, it's easy for people to then go with you and whatever interpretation you put to it because they feel you are closer to the ultimate being than they are. And this is where, it then challenges our societies in terms of what it means to have progressive policies on certain issues. Because then, once people are fixated about their religion and believe that ultimately it is this superhuman being or super being that is dictating what we should be doing, it becomes more challenging for policymakers to drive certain policies forward if the population is against or does not agree with it because of what they believe in. And I think
Yeah.
the interaction between foundations like the Gates or Ford Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, who support some of this work on the ground, like sexual reproductive health and rights, couple that with what the evangelical groups are doing on the continent, there seems to be this tug of war
Yeah.
where there's a push for progressivity and there's this conservative movement that are also making sure that and they have quite a bit of influence because they are strategic in who they engage. And they try to target people who really make decisions about the laws and policies and influencing them through those channels.
Joseph, we are increasingly living in a world that is shaped by artificial intelligence. And so I don't think you can have any conversation these days like this without addressing AI. Let's start, if we could, by what do you think Africans think of AI based on the work you all have been doing listening to African voices?
All right. So from the ordinary citizen side, AI is yet to get seep into the public consciousness in terms of general population use. And so this is been conversations with more the elites, say in the elite circles, with government officials and with civil society groups and actors who are much more advanced in these issues. Of course, for our surveys, usually we ask questions on the topics that have seeped into the public consciousness, such that an average person in the country can actually respond to questions about them. And
Sure.
what we have been starting to learn in recent conversations have been, first of all, the training of AI models with data on different issues, whether you're going to ask about query the AI about policy issues or query it about anything else on the continent. The question is, what is the data that is being used to feed into these AI models that then allows us to use them for information or predictions, or even
Sure.
asking for policy advice of sorts. And so, because of the lack of data on the continent, on some aspects, I mean, in several aspects of the continent, the question is, how do we make sure that we build enough data systems and data sources on the continent that is context relevant so that they can be fed into these models in a way that allows them to give the continent tools that can be useful for decision making, for example, or even policy making over time. Because we know that this tool is going to overtake a lot of things when it comes to policy making, decision making. Increasingly, people are going to rely on it. So, making sure that we have enough good quality data on the continent that can be fed into these models is one thing. The second piece is just coming down to AI governance. And of course, this is a tool that is not necessarily controlled fully by governments. Governments can regulate, but this is the private sector. And the private sector that is actually behind these models are not necessarily located on the continent. And so there can be a huge amount of influence in terms of what is done on the continent without the continent really playing a role in contributing to its development. So increasingly, what we've been doing to think about, okay, how does the African Union, the regional economic bodies, think of ways to make sure that Africa it just plugs into the AI environment and can build AI systems on the continent because we have young people who are very savvy on these issues, but they would need that kind of infrastructure support that can allow them to contribute to the development of artificial intelligence. And we think that that is also important. So having the data sets that will be relevant for training them, but having the human capital developed well and the infrastructure on the continent to allow Africa to contribute to this revolution.
So going back to your first point, Joseph, about AI sort of being trained on African data, point well taken. I have heard someone say, ChatGPT is American, right? And so it thinks as an American thinks it, and thus what it gives you is as an American would answer the question. I'm curious from an Afrobarometer perspective, you all are sitting on a ton of data about what Africans think and believe. Has there been discussion about intentionally feeding your data into the models such that there's more representation of African perspectives in the models?
Exactly. And we've started having those conversations already. I've had conversations with Meta and other, AI developers to think about ways in which Afrobarometer data can be integrated in training some of these models. There are two ways we are thinking about that. First of all, just having the Afrobarometer data as part of training for these models. But secondly, thinking about language translation. We have had almost like 25 years worth of translations of setting, of our questions. And so we can take the translated files and feed these into models that would be used for translating into local African languages, both contributing to being able to translate into African languages, but also contributing our data into AI models that just learn about the context on the continent and ways in which African data can be used to contextualize some of the outcomes or outputs of these models is something that we are pushing forward quite hardly on.
Do you see AI as an opportunity for Africa?
I do think it's a big opportunity and also for the Western world, especially for the issue around immigration. If you want African skill and talent to be tapped in any way in the development of these models, especially the contribution to the technology sector, you can actually do that without having people physically be present in whichever location it is. And so you may not have to struggle to do that. And of course, it can be a win-win because then you can have people physically present on the African continent contributing to something that is global in nature, but still resident in their countries and contributing to their own economies. And I think, if you want to limit immigration, then maybe that is the area to invest in. That is, young Africans who are savvy in technology and savvy in different aspects or different areas of an economic system, and that investing in those areas, and that's the role that some of the private foundations have played on the continent, where invest in specific areas that can generate, both jobs for young people, but also tap talent that you can tap remotely into supporting whatever you want to do, especially in the Western world. That can easily be done remotely. And I have always engaged with African government to talk about these issues about brain drain. I mean, in this day and era where technology is so advanced, we shouldn't be thinking about talking about brain drain because somebody can sit in the United States, a medical doctor can sit in the United States and work in a village in Ghana.
Sure.
And so I do think that there are those opportunities to be taken if we want to limit immigration but still have a good human resource base to contribute to the development of artificial
You
intelligence.
have to have the human resource base, but also, and I just love your thoughts on this, you have to have the electricity as well, right? To power this. And we're seeing more and more about how much electricity AI data centers are taking. And I know at least in certain cases like South Africa, there have been difficulties in the recent past in consistent and reliable delivery of electricity. So I assume African governments are thinking about that if they're thinking about how they can take advantage of the AI boom.
Yes, I think that's the biggest challenge now because the continent is limited in terms of electricity supply at the moment. We don't really have the infrastructure to provide consistent, reliable energy, even for the industry that we have now. And so, if you are to set up data centers, then that means that governments will need to invest a lot. Of course, governments working with the private sector to
Right.
invest a lot in electricity production. And I think that will be a big challenge. Of course, the hope is that at some point, AI, the artificial intelligence sector, will evolve in a way that it doesn't consume way too much electricity.
Right.
I think there's
Right.
some efficiency gains that need to be done in that space.
Because of course the reality too is that Africa, um, particularly in places like the Sahel, is as vulnerable, dangerously vulnerable to the effects of climate change as any place else on the planet. And there's not only going to need to be investment to take advantage of the economic opportunities, which are going to be incredibly high consumers of energy, but also rapid adaptation just to protect human health and security.
Absolutely. And of course, climate change is certainly, it does seem like AI and climate change are probably going to be the existential crisis for the human race, or if because one, as you rightly point out, adaptation is one thing, but also just thinking about creative ways in which, you know, a changing climate, people living in environments like the Sahel would be able to survive in a constrained environment where they may use previously to get some kind of rain-fed agriculture for 3 months in a year. And now it probably almost shrinking down to about a month or so a year. And to struggle for 11 months of drought, that is huge. And what kind of adaptation would we be thinking about when it comes to those extreme cases where people's just their daily livelihoods are dependent on what is happening to the environment?
People want to own something of their own, right? And they want to have a stake. They want to have, I mean, even if it's just a local food shop, right? They want to have a stake in um, their country and their community. And I mean, I think one of the things we need to be thinking about across the world right now, particularly as we think about these various geopolitical crises, the prevalence of loneliness, the epidemic of loneliness all over the world, is giving people not only a voice, but a real stake.
And having a stake is very, very important because then it gives you a reason to want to hold your government accountable. Because if you have a stake in the economy, you pay attention to policy making in your government, like the decision
Right.
that policymakers arrive at, whether they're talking about infrastructure or anything else or taxes, you will pay attention. And I think that then reinforces the social contract between governments and their citizens. Because a breakdown of the social contract is often what leads to people become apathetic about engaging with the government, and government becomes also unconcerned, and they can, you know, rule in ways that they probably wouldn't care about the citizenry. But then
Yeah.
if you have people increasingly having a stake, you have a small shop somewhere, and you know that, your profit margins will be undermined by the next tax that the government is going to introduce. Your interest in really coming out and not actually protesting or engaging with governments in constructive ways to think about a more kind of approach to taxation that is more progressive and allowing businesses to thrive can be very valuable. And I think, yes, I do agree. And we are not surprised that more and more people want to own their business, but that also creates this potential for accountability.
Yeah. That's great. Joseph, we always ask same last question. What's one project you've dreamed of but haven't started yet?
Our biggest dream is to be sure that we cover the entire continent. We think every citizen on the continent in every country deserves to be heard, and their voices should be heard in policy making. So far, we've been able to do that and touch about 42 countries.
What keeps you out of the 12 that you're not in?
So some of the things, I mean, there are several considerations before we go in. First of all, is political stability, because we do our service face to face, and if we don't have security guaranteed, it's difficult to
Mhm.
get into certain
Sure.
countries. The second is whether or not people would speak freely, speak their minds freely. And so if you get into a country and you ask about whether people trust the president, will they tell you the truth, or they will give you socially desirable answers? And so that's one consideration. Then the final one being census maps, because we want to draw a nationally representative sample. We want to make sure that it reflects the true population. But if the country hasn't conducted census for the past 10 years, it becomes very difficult to really draw a
Sure.
truly representative sample. And but there are countries that had their census maybe in 1975 and no census since, and so
I see.
that keeps us out.
Great.
Yeah.
Joseph Asunka, CEO of Afrobarometer, thank you so much for joining us on Per Capita.
Thank you so much, and yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.